Okay, true story. An English teacher in Michigan, high school teacher, assigns his kids to do a paper about El Salvador. He's reading the papers, and one kid's paper in particular stops him cold. The kid is just reciting the usual stuff you would about the government, what you'd expect, the exports of El Salvador. And then suddenly, almost in the middle of a paragraph, he's talking about General William Booth and his followers who worked to help the downtrodden by spreading Christian gospel. What the hell is this? The teacher is thinking, and suddenly a light bulb goes on and he realizes what happened. The kid was just mindlessly copying details from the encyclopedia in its article about El Salvador, and he must have accidentally turned 2 pages at once and was in the middle now of an article about the Salvation Army, and he didn't even realize it. This is almost like a projective test when you hear this story. It tells you about yourself. Are you appalled or are you amused? More importantly, are you thinking about the kid critically, who's such an idiot, or are you thinking about the assignment that the kid and his classmates had to do? I'm happy to report that the teacher who told the story about what happened was in the latter camp. This was the day that he decided to stop assigning things to kids where they could just fulfill the assignment by copying details from the encyclopedia. In another episode of Cone Zone, I talked about the fundamental attribution error, which is what social psychologists use to refer to the tendency to think in terms of individuals, how their talents, their effort, their morals explain what they do, when most of the time what we do is a function of the environment in which we find ourselves. Maybe the best example of the fundamental attribution error is cheating, and how it is that we focus on the kids who cheat and how this is emblematic of a decline in morality, how we can catch them, how we can deter them. But maybe something else is going on now. Maybe we need to be thinking more deeply about why students cheat. The best way to think about who does it and how come and what it means to cheat in the first place. That's on this episode of Cone Zone. I'm Alfie Cone. Cheating comes to be thought of more prominently in certain eras when certain things are going on, such that we find ourselves possibly facing more of it. A few years ago, during the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of virtual teaching and learning going on, and immediately a rush to insert spyware on computers so that kids couldn't get away with something when they were doing their assignment. We needed to watch them through their laptops. Now we're finding more talk about cheating in the context of chatbots, artificial intelligence. Instead of spending most of our time being concerned with how AI might adversely affect teaching and learning, an awful lot of the discussion is just about whether kids will be able to cheat by having chatbots write their papers for them. So let's think about cheating for a moment. In the context of the fundamental attribution error, I want to tell you about a classic social science study that was conducted about 100 years ago in the 1920s. Classic study at Teachers College, Columbia University. They followed almost 11,000 kids, ages 8 to 16, over a period of 5 years. It was a pretty substantial study. And what they discovered, their primary finding regarding cheating, is that the correspondence between what any given child would do in two different educational environments was, quote, lower than would be required for accurate prediction of individual behavior. This is the main point that these social scientists found. Cheating, they said, quote, is as much a function of the particular situation in which the student is placed as it is of his own inner experience and training, his general ideas and ideals, his fears, ambition, and purposes. In other words, if you want to understand cheating and why it happens, stop focusing on the characteristics of individual students, such as a deficit in their moral fiber, and instead look at how they're being taught. Look at the way the school is being set up, the values, the practices, the policies of the schools and classrooms. Not that anybody takes this seriously, because most of the time people are still just focused on the bad kids who cheat. And in fact, research on this has continued. In the last couple of decades, we've got a bunch of studies to answer the question, okay, what about the classroom or school does lead more kids to cheat? My reading of this body of research is that there are basically four answers to this question. First, when kids perceive that their teachers don't really care much about them as individuals or have much connection with them, kids are far more likely to cheat. Again, note it's about the kid's perception. What predicts to understanding what happens is the perception of the people involved, the kids, not what the teachers think about what they're doing or why. And maybe this seems to you pretty obvious that if kids don't feel cared about by their teachers, they're more likely to cheat. But if you take that finding seriously, it really kind of turns on its head most of the way people think about and write about the problem of cheating. In 2015, there was a study published in the journal Contemporary Educational Psychology that focused on the concept of need fulfillment. People have basic needs, including kids, which according to self-determination theory, a major branch of psychology, are focused around the need for people to feel autonomy, a sense of control over what happens to them, belongingness, sense of connection with others, and competence, feeling like you're learning and able to display things that matter to you that you're getting better at. Well, a group of researchers took college students and gave them a couple of different tasks that required some thinking, some creativity, and half of them were given the instructions for the experiment in a way that was supportive. It communicated a concern about their experience of the experiment. It gave them more choice. Remember, you can decide which of these to do first, and so on. And the other half of them were basically just told, here's what you have to do. There was no sense that anybody cared about them or gave them any choice. Well, the students who felt that sense of need fulfillment, that somebody was concerned about them, turned out to be much less likely to cheat when they had opportunities to do so in this experimental arrangement. The same researchers did a follow-up study with middle school students and found that those students, quoting now, whose basic psychological needs were satisfied in school had higher autonomous motivation for learning, which in turn predicted a lesser likelihood of academic dishonesty. So that's the first thing that leads kids to cheat, whether their needs are met, whether they feel cared about, and so on. Second, when students experience the curriculum as boring or overwhelming or just pointless and irrelevant, they are much more likely to cheat. Conversely, cheating is rare in classrooms where the learning is experienced by the students. Again, that experience is what matters, as engaging and meaningful. Or when kids are in classes that are more democratic, where the students play a meaningful role in deciding on the norms of the classroom as well as the curriculum itself. This goes all the way back to that Teachers College study 100 years ago. Progressive school experiences are less conducive to deception than conventional school experiences. That's a direct quote from the big study. And that was even after they controlled for age and IQ and family background and so on. In fact, the more time students spent in a progressive school, the kind of place where students have more autonomy, there's more sense of community, there's more of a connection with the teachers and so on, the more time they spent in progressive schools, as opposed to traditional schools, the greater the difference in terms of the amount of cheating. Third, when students perceive that the point here of what I'm doing every day in school is to get good grades, they are far more likely to cheat. Especially if the importance of grades is really driven home by posting the grades online or putting them up somewhere publicly or having honor rolls or other incentives that are given either by the school or the parent, basically a reward for getting a reward. Everything is about getting good grades. In fact, more broadly, it's not just about the grades, it's about that performance emphasis. This is what I talked about in another episode called Little Ed Koch's, that when the focus in a given school or classroom is less about what they're doing, the learning, but more on how well they're doing, their achievement, you get a whole bunch of problems. The achievement focus leads to kids who are less interested and excited about learning, less likely to think deeply, less likely to prefer challenging tasks. And now we can add to that list, they are much more likely to cheat. For example, one study of California high schoolers found that the more that classrooms drew attention to academic performance, the more students, quote, observed and engaged in various types of cheating. Other research finds that there's less cheating when the whole point is to enjoy learning, when the point is understanding, not memorizing facts, when mistakes are just accepted as a natural result of exploration. Even students who admitted that cheating is wrong were more likely to engage in it when the school culture was all about results. When you think about this for a minute, it makes perfect sense. I mean, if the point is to look impressive, get good grades, and so on, yeah, if you don't get caught, cheating can probably help. So it would appeal to somebody who had those goals. But if your goal is to figure stuff out, then it's pointless to cheat because that's not going to help you to understand an idea. It's very much like what I said about artificial intelligence. It's about chatbots are going to be really appealing to people where the goal of education is just to acquire a credential, to get credits. But if you want to read deeply, if you want to enjoy writing and learn how to do it better, you would never use a chatbot. You would never use ChatGPT or anything like that, because that's not going to help you think. It's not going to help you write or read or learn. So the more you're focused on the performance type of stuff, the more likely you are to use AI, and the more likely you are to cheat. And those two sometimes overlap, of course. So how do kids develop those performance goals instead of learning goals? Well, goals, attitudes, behaviors are shaped by the environment you're in. So cheating is mostly symptomatic of the priorities of the schools and the practices of the educators. And finally, the fourth consideration in thinking about why kids are more likely to cheat is closely related to the third. What is even more cheatogenic, to use a classic word that I just made up this second, what's more likely to lead kids to cheat is not just a place that focuses on performance, how well I'm doing in school, but how much better I'm doing than others. Competition, the ultimate example of not being about exploration of ideas. Here it's about beating people, creating artificial scarcity. Other kids sitting around me are now viewed as obstacles to my own success. If they do well, it means I can't do as well, because somebody has put a limit on the number of recognitions, certificates, plaques, trophies, or even sometimes grades. Grades are bad enough. A grade-focused school is going to lead kids to cheat. But a school that ranks kids against each other, talks about class rank, or grades on a curve so that we're pitted against each other, is even more likely to create cheating. Not just rewards, but awards. A competitive school environment is to cheating as a warm, moist environment is to mold. Except the difference is we don't condemn the mold spores for growing. We don't blame the victims there. Martin Covington was an educational psychologist who was really interested in this topic. He wrote in his book, Making the Grade, quote, "Cheating qualifies as part of the unhealthy legacy that results from having tied one's sense of worth to achieving competitively." He went out and he talked to a bunch of kids to get their sense of the experience of cheating. They said things to him like, these are direct quotes, "Kids don't cheat because they're bad. They're afraid they aren't smart, and they're afraid what'll happen if they don't do good." Another kid said, "Those who cheat feel really bad, but it's better than being yelled at for bad grades." Third kid, "People cheat because they're afraid of doing poorer than other kids and feeling miserable for being different and behind. Some do it to be the best in class or to move to the next group." The irony here is that the adults who most vociferously condemn cheating often are the traditionalists who support competition and grades and, all about raising the bar and so on. They confuse competitiveness with excellence, and so they end up promoting the very thing that they are at pains to condemn, namely cheating itself. Now, competition isn't new, of course, so guess what? Cheating isn't new either. The psychologist Elliot Turiel compared surveys going back to the 1920s up to the present day and found that about the same percentage of kids admitted to cheating. That's really interesting because people with this sense of aggressive nostalgia constantly talk about how much better things were in the old days. People were more moral and kids were more polite and so on, none of which is true. We have other research on morality not changing. But people always tend to see the past with a rosy glow. And it turns out that cheating is nothing new. If some versions of cheating are more common now, well, then maybe it's because competition is more rampant and more virulent, so there's a stronger push to break the rules. Anyway, the point is that cheating becomes a rational choice in a culture with warped values. And we're going to miss all of that if we just talk about certain kids because of their makeup, because of their personality, because of their ethical problems are doing the cheating. That's going to let off the hook the people who create the kind of schools that either promote or discourage cheating. So up until now, my question has been, what leads to cheating? But now I want to ask a deeper question. What is cheating? How does it get defined? I mean, even when we more deeply investigate the situations that give rise to it, we're ignoring the process by which we come to decide what's going to be classified as cheating. You look at the social context, but we're still assuming that cheating, almost by definition, is unethical, right? But if cheating is defined as a violation of academic rules, maybe we need to ask if the rules are reasonable, and who devised them, and who stands to benefit by them. But very few people, of course, do ask those questions. Now, some kinds of cheating are clearly objectionable, although even here there are some qualifications attached. Let's take plagiarism, for example. It's pretty hard sometimes to draw the line between an idea you had that was influenced by what you read that other people came up with on the one hand, and an idea that was clearly found in what you read, and it originated with somebody else. And in that case, it ought to be identified as such. So, it is wrong to use a specific concept or a verbatim passage from another source without giving credit if your objective was to deceive the reader about the origin. And by the way, that last qualification is really important too. The intent to deceive matters because a lot of times plagiarism is done unconsciously. It's so common to borrow someone else's work while you genuinely believe it's your own that it has a name. Researchers call it cryptomnesia, and there's a bunch of studies about it. But I'm prepared to say that if you did it on purpose and you're clearly trying to pass off someone else's work as your own, that kind of plagiarism is wrong. Okay. But more interesting, I think, and just as common, are other kinds of cheating, where there's a failure to abide by restrictions that may be, frankly, kind of arbitrary, kind of hard to defend. So you understand what I'm saying here? It's not just that questionable educational practices may lead to cheating. It's that questionable educational practices may be responsible for defining certain behaviors as cheating. And without those practices and the ideology that supports them, such behaviors wouldn't be seen as illegitimate. There's lots of things in our lives that we regard as just facts of life that we can pass judgment on that actually depend on a social context for their very existence. The example I love to use is sportsmanship. When you play a game, sportsmanship only exists if the game you're playing is competitive. When people are playing cooperative games, where the whole point is for everybody to do stuff together, to be effective at it or to complete a task in a given period of time, if we're all cooperating, the concept of sportsmanship has no meaning at all. You only have to be told to be gracious about doing it if the point is to defeat other people on the playing field. You take away competition, poof, there's no such thing as sportsmanship. Something very similar is true of theft. It only exists in cultures that have private property. In non-industrialized cultures where everybody shares everything, stealing doesn't happen. And I don't just mean people don't engage in it. I mean the concept has no meaning. You see what I mean? I live in Boston. The concept of jaywalking has no meaning because there's no shared norm that you're supposed to cross only at the intersection. Anyway, you get the idea. So the question now is, what does the concept of cheating depend on for its existence? By way of an answer to that, let me tell you about a scandal at MIT in the 1990s. More than 70 students were punished for cheating. Why? Because they worked in small groups to write code together because otherwise there's no way they could have kept up with the class assignments. So cooperative learning, students learning with and from one another in pairs and small groups, has multiple benefits. It helps kids to think, not only to exchange ideas and divide up tasks to be more effective, but when it's done right, students in cooperative groups also tend to think in more sophisticated ways than students who are doing stuff all on their own. They also tend to end up with better self-esteem, more satisfying relationships with their fellow classmates, and so on. So cooperative learning makes a lot more sense for many reasons. But most American classrooms are so steeped in our culture of individualism that it's called cheating when you do stuff with other people. Instead of having serious conversations about under what circumstances should we have students do stuff in groups, we just basically write it off. So let me give you another example of what's called cheating, where I think we would want to raise a question about that. Consulting reference sources when somebody decides that's forbidden. The real question here is why it's forbidden, which is to say, why is there a test at all? And if we're going to have a test, why is it closed book? Here, the priority is not on thinking, but on mere memorization. What pedagogical purpose is served by making students cram facts into their heads so that then, if they consult a book or the internet, they're a cheater? What's the purpose of this assessment? I mean, students who use, quote, unauthorized materials during a test, yeah, they compromise the teacher's preferred assessment method. But we should be questioning the legitimacy of that method, I think, and asking why it's unauthorized. Now, it's sort of interesting that in one classroom, those two things I've talked about, studying cooperatively and consulting reference sources, will be classified as cheating with all the grave implications and practical repercussions that attach to that label, cheating. But in another classroom, maybe down the hall, either of those things will be fine. So students who are unlucky enough to find themselves in the first classroom stand condemned of being cheaters, with very little attention paid to the nature of the rules they broke. I think their actions have violated a purely conventional set of prohibitions. What they've done is like walking into a lecture hall through a door marked exit. But they're being treated as though they're guilty of a moral infraction, like lying or stealing. And yet people continue to just write about cheating, shaking their heads about how it's an epidemic, the number of kids who cheat, and talking about how devious their methods are. And the focus is on the individuals and how bad they are, rather than on the individualism or the memorization-focused approach to teaching and assessment. That's why it was so refreshing that Michigan high school English teacher, when he saw that the kids were just mindlessly copying facts from the encyclopedia, stopped to ask about the assignment instead of just blaming the kids. I remember when I was a kid, if you did something, you took a shortcut of some kind with your homework, the teacher would say sanctimoniously, you're only cheating yourself. Well, let's unpack that. That assumes that to do the assignment the way the teacher wanted me to do it would prove valuable if I did it correctly, which opens up a whole set of questions about whether research suggests that homework is valuable academically. Spoiler alert, generally it is not. But here too, maybe the violation of the teacher's rules not only doesn't constitute a moral infraction, Maybe it also may not diminish learning. Maybe all the outraged condemnations of cheating sometimes have more to do with power than with either ethics or pedagogy. Maybe the outrage over cheating has less to do with kids having a lack of integrity than it does with their lack of conformity. Maybe you don't agree with that. Have I gone too far for you? But even if you don't agree with all these conclusions, I hope you'll agree that these are the questions worth asking on this subject about what has come to be called cheating. We should look at the whole educational system and our cultural beliefs rather than just at the behavior of students. We should look more deeply about who cheats and why, but also more deeply about what defines the very concept of cheating, which after all is just the tail. How we educate students is the dog.